Lecture 6. The Problem of Personal Identity.
In the introduction, we discussed how metaphysics is done. It examines some of our most fundamental assumptions about the way the world is by assuming their truth, but then subjecting them to extreme scrutiny. In the previous few lectures, we scrutinized the idea that persons have minds. We assumed that they did and tried to account for why minds exist and how they are related to the brain. Along the way, we even discovered a philosophical theory that suggests that minds don't exist at all. An assumption we made as we investigated these questions was that persons, which supposedly have minds, exist. Even if you favored eliminative materialism, the theory that suggested that minds don't exist, you probably never thought to doubt the existence of persons. However, whether persons exist is another question that needs to be examined, another assumption that needs scrutiny. To be clear, the question of whether persons exist is not a question about the reality of the outside world. We are not wondering whether other persons exist, as we might do if we worried about whether or not we were stuck in an Inception-style perpetual dream. No, we are wondering whether persons exist at all, whether persons are real existing objects. We're also not worried about whether bodies exist. The philosopher René Descartes wondered if perhaps he was being deceived by an evil demon into believing he had a body when in fact he was only a disembodied mind. That is not our worry. For the sake of argument, we will circumvent such epistemological problems and grant the assumption that human bodies exist. The question is whether distinct entities called persons, connected to but above and beyond human bodies, exist. To wrap your head around what I mean by persons, think about a couple of examples. Consider when someone dies. Their body still exists, lying in the casket, yet we no longer think they are there. Perhaps we think they cease to exist upon death. Perhaps we think they traveled into the afterlife. Either way, we think the person is now missing. But what exactly is missing that was there before? What isn't there now? Whatever that is, that's what philosophers mean by person. Now clearly, the mere existence of a person's body is not sufficient for that person's existence. The fact that persons are no longer where their dead body lies shows this. But that doesn't mean that the person can't exist without a body. Maybe having a body is necessary, maybe not. But the point is, this is the concept of personhood philosophers have in mind. It's a kind of discrete object that we might say exists in addition to a physical body, but may or may not be dependent upon it. To wrap their heads around the problem of personal identity over time, philosophers usually think about this problem. Imagine yourself at 8 years old. What were you like? Where did you live? What did you do? What did you believe? How are you different now? Notice that all of those questions make the same assumption. The 8-year-old person you are thinking about is you. That person is numerically identical to you. I know that person has a different set of beliefs, knows a lot less, likely has a distinct personality. There is a whole lot of differences. But that 8-year-old person is you in the same way that Clark Kent is Superman. They are one and the same person. You now and your 8-year-old self are both the same person. Now, it's important to realize that we are not concerned about whether or not you are the same kind of person over time. Sometimes after experiencing something traumatic, someone might say, "I'm just not the same person anymore." What they mean is that they are not the same kind of person. Their personality or disposition has changed. And that may be true, but they have not become someone else. The person who was their 8-year-old self has not ceased to exist, and another person did not come into existence. If their 8-year-old self had done something morally wrong to someone else, they would be morally culpable for it. If they ran into that person today, it would be their obligation to apologize to that person. Even if their 8-year-old self was a jerk, and they are now a very nice person, even if their personality has completely changed, and thus they are now a totally different kind of person, they are still the same person. They are numerically identical to their 8-year-old self. That persons exist and that you are identical to your past self is something that we will begin by assuming. But now that it is assumed, we will turn around and scrutinize those assumptions to determine whether or not they are true. The question we will consider is this: assuming that you now and your 8-year-old self are the same person, in virtue of what is that true? What makes that identity hold? To get at exactly what this question is asking, philosophers often consider what is called the ship of Theseus thought experiment. It goes something like this. Suppose a man named Theseus owns a ship, and the ship is about to go on a long 7-year journey. And so he packed it full of wooden barrels of food for its crew. The ship sails off, and along its journey, the wood out of which the ship is constructed starts to rot away piece by piece. And so the crew uses the wood from their used barrels of food to repair the ship, replacing one plank at a time and throwing the old rotted planks overboard. It's a long journey, and by the time they reach their destination, each original plank of wood has been thrown overboard and replaced with a plank of wood from one of the barrels. Question: is the ship that arrives at its destination point 7 years later Theseus's ship? Is it one and the same object? If Theseus was to receive a reward for his ship successfully making the journey, should he receive the award? If the ship returns to his home, can he truthfully claim it's his ship? Or is it another ship made out of barrels? If it is still Theseus's ship, in virtue of what is it the same ship? Why is it the same ship? You might think this example has little to do with the why are you now and your 8-year-old self the same person question, but it actually has everything to do with it. It reveals why one of the easy answers to the question doesn't work. We can't just say that you now and your 8-year-old self are the same person because they have the same body, that is, because they're made of the same material. Because, just like the ship of Theseus, your parts are replaced over time as well. In simplified terms, as time passes, each atom or cell of your body is sloughed off, and your body uses material that you ingest from the outside world to construct replacement parts for them. Different organs do it at different rates, but on average, about every 7 years, your body is made of entirely new material. Just like the ship of Theseus, the material that makes you up is thrown off out into the world and replaced with new material that you take on through ingestion, not unlike the barrels on Theseus's ship. We can't say that Theseus's ship is still Theseus's ship because it is made of the same material, because it's not. In the same way, we can't say that you now and your 8-year-old self are the same person because they're made of the same material, because they're not. So the question remains, in virtue of what are you and the ship of Theseus the same object over time? Now, there are ways of telling whether or not you're the same person. For example, the fact that you now and your 8-year-old self have the same fingerprints would be a good indication that you're the same person. Maybe you still have some identifying scar. But these do not help us answer our questions. It is not in virtue of these things that you are the same person over time. If you filed off your fingerprints or lost your hand and had no fingerprints, you would still be the same person, identical to your 8-year-old self. If that scar completely healed, you wouldn't cease to be you. You might think that it is in virtue of the fact that you and your 8-year-old self have the same DNA that you are the same person over time, but that doesn't work either. Even if identical twins had the same DNA, they are not the same person. And if we ever perfect human cloning, your clone would have the same DNA as you, but would not be the same person as you. If your clone did something morally wrong, you would not be morally culpable. You would not have to apologize. Figuring out the answer to this question is very important. Not only is our very concept of personhood up for grabs here, but only if we can make sense of personal identity over time can we hope to make sense of an afterlife. If you are to survive your death, some person that exists in heaven after your death has to be numerically identical to you, in the same way that you are numerically identical to your 8-year-old self. If not, then you didn't really survive into the afterlife. If it turns out that what preserves personal identity is somehow irrevocably broken upon death, and thus no person in the afterlife could be identical to you, then survival into an afterlife is impossible. The same would follow if the very concept of personal survival over time, or even personhood, breaks down. At this point, it's probably important to mention that hand-waving answers to these questions are not satisfactory for the metaphysician. When asking why you are the same person as your 8-year-old self, you can't merely say, "I just am." That's not helpful. We're assuming that you are, but we want to know why. In addition, when it comes to questions about how you could be identical to some person in the afterlife, it will not do to simply suggest, "I just am," or "God makes me identical." These are unhelpful, unsatisfactory answers that do not get us closer to the truth or to understanding. The one who gives these kinds of answers to these kinds of questions merely reveals that they are not concerned with learning the truth or with doing metaphysics. But speaking of the afterlife, that brings us to what is probably the most common answer to the question of personal survival over time. Why are you now and your 8-year-old self the same person? Because you have the same soul. This is the classic Platonic concept that many non-metaphysicians embrace. Recall, a soul is a separate substance that contains our mentality. The soul hypothesis is the idea that our mind is a distinct entity that is separable from our body and brain. A common belief is that we each have a soul over the course of our life, and it is in virtue of having a soul that we are the same person over time. And when we die, our soul floats away from our body and enters the afterlife. So how is it that some person that exists in heaven after my death can be identical to me? Because that person has, or simply is, my soul. But if you're listening to these lectures in order, you're probably already anticipating a number of objections. In the second lecture, we discussed many philosophic and scientific problems with the soul hypothesis. The philosophical arguments for it fail, which is very problematic since the burden of proof would be on the side of the soul hypothesis believer. And the philosophic objections to the existence of the soul, such as the problem of downwards causation, are very persuasive. In fact, the existence of the soul would seem to violate numerous well-established physical laws. In addition, neuroscience has taught us that our minds are not separable from our bodies, and certainly aren't contained in a separate, distinct substance. Mental activity is reliant upon the brain for existence. Thus, if you no longer have a functioning brain, your mind no longer exists. We also discussed why, even though belief in souls is common, the non-existence of the soul is not actually that problematic. Most religions don't believe in souls, including early Christianity, and the existence of the soul is not necessary for an afterlife. We'll talk more about that later. But even if we grant that souls exist, they actually can't help us answer the problem of personal identity over time. In other words, even if you have a soul, it could not be in virtue of the fact that you have the same soul over time that you are the same person over time. This is true for 3 reasons. First of all, if souls preserve personal identity, they also preserve personal distinctiveness. In other words, the reason that you and I are not the same person would have to be because we don't have the same soul. But that means our souls must be distinguishable. Our souls can't actually be numerically identical. But in virtue of what would they be different? You can't say it's because they have different thoughts, because at 8 years old, your soul would have had different thoughts than you do now. But that doesn't mean that you now and your 8-year-old self have different souls. Souls are not collections of thoughts, they are that which contain thoughts. They are thinking entities. So you can't distinguish souls by the thoughts they contain any more than you could distinguish 2 pin cushions by the pins they contain. So, in virtue of what would 2 souls be different objects? If we have 2 physically identical pencils, we could distinguish them as separate objects based on their location. One would occupy an area of space that the other one didn't. But that doesn't work for souls because souls are immaterial objects. They have no location. So you can't use their location to distinguish them. You also couldn't distinguish them by their composition, how they look, what shape they have, because none of these things apply to immaterial objects. In fact, if souls are made of a separate substance, as substance dualists suggest, the substance that souls are supposedly made of is a complete mystery. We keep saying that they are made of an immaterial substance, but that's not a useful description. All that means is that the substance of which they are made is not material. It's not physical matter. But that doesn't tell me anything. I'm reminded of the time I went water skiing with my friend Marty. He turned the radio on to a local station. His daughter complained. "Turn on some good music," she said. "What's good music?" he asked. "Not this," she replied. Perhaps true, I don't remember what was playing, but this is not a useful description. This does not tell me what good music is, it just tells me what it isn't. In the same way, saying the soul is made of an immaterial substance only tells me that the substance is not matter. It does not tell me what it actually is, and it certainly doesn't tell me anything about it. Even if souls are not made of an immaterial substance, as some philosophers suggest, and instead only possess non-material properties, the problem still remains. We still have no way to tell two souls apart, and what they are is still a complete mystery. The truth is, if souls exist, we know nothing about them, and we have no way to distinguish one soul from another. So we can't use souls to distinguish persons. Explaining one thing with something else that itself needs explaining is not philosophically enlightening. Second of all, souls can preserve personal identity over time only if they are sufficient for personal survival. In other words, souls can account for personal survival only if having the same soul over time is enough to preserve personal identity. But it seems that this is not the case. To help make this point, the philosopher Leibniz asks us to imagine a man, let's call him Bob, who wakes up one day and is king of China, a very desirable thing to be in Leibniz's day. But this new king of China, even though he has the same soul as Bob, his soul has been emptied of all its memories. The new king of China remembers nothing of who he once was and never will. No element of his former self remains. Not his personality, not his wants and desires, nothing. Question: is this new king of China numerically identical to Bob? If the day before it happened, Bob knew it was going to happen, would he be glad? Would he think, "Oh, good, tomorrow I'll be king of China"? Or as another example, consider this. If your soul went to heaven, but when it did, it forgot everything about who you are and who you knew, would you think that that meant that you survived into the afterlife? Most people think not. The mere survival of one's soul is not sufficient for the survival of the self. Some kind of mental continuity seems to be required. Lastly, souls can preserve personal identity over time only if they are necessary for personal survival. In other words, souls can account for personal survival only if you must have the same soul over time to be the same person over time. But again, this doesn't seem to be the case. Suppose you are sitting in a room with one other person. Instantaneously, your soul dumps out all of your memories, thoughts, and personality, all the mentality it contains, and so does the other person's soul. This would be like having Alzheimer's, or like a steel rod going through your skull a la Phineas Gage. All your mentality is just gone. And if you think that souls accumulate moral credit and demerit, we could say that it loses that too. But then your soul takes on all of the other person's mentality, its moral credit, everything, and attaches itself to their body, while their soul takes on your mentality and moral credit and attaches itself to your body. In other words, suppose you switch souls with the other person in the room, but nothing else. Which person would you be? If I were going to give $1 million to one of those two people, which one would you prefer I give it to? If you're like most, you would want the million to go to the person with your memories and personality and body. The location of the immaterial substance that originally housed your thoughts doesn't matter. In fact, this little thought experiment reveals a major shortcoming with the soul hypothesis in general. Ask yourself, next time you're sitting in a room with someone else, how do you know that you didn't just switch souls? Now, I'm not talking about your soul leaving your body with all your thoughts and memory and personality and placing itself in someone else's body and someone else's soul doing the same thing to your body. If that happened, it would be clear that it had happened. since the person in the other body would now have all your memories, and those memories would include having the body you had when you walked in the room, that person would notice that they had a different body. They wouldn't have the body that they remembered. So that would be obvious. I'm not talking about the switching of memories and personality. I'm just talking about the soul, the substance that supposedly contains your memories and personality. If your mind was dumped into a new substance and the substance that used to contain your mind went to someone else, how could you tell? What difference would it make? Since there is nothing to distinguish such substances, it seems that there would be no way to tell. It wouldn't make any difference. And, truth be told, a difference that makes no difference is no difference at all. Suppose someone told you that they could turn lead into gold by putting it through a machine. Sounds good, right? But, they said, when it comes out the other side, it would still look like lead. And it would feel like lead. And it would taste like lead. And if you put it under a microscope, it will have all lead-like properties. In fact, all scientific tests will show it to be lead because it will still have the atomic structure of lead. But they claim it will still turn it into gold because the machine will change the essence of the lead to gold. Would you buy such a machine? Would you think the machine did anything? Would you think the salesman's claims about essence were even meaningful? Would you think there is such a thing as the essence of gold? Likely not. A difference that makes no difference is not a difference at all. In the same way, simply switching the substance that contains one's mentality would be undetectable. It would make no difference. For all we know, this happens all the time. And so there is no real reason to think that such a substance exists, like there is no reason to think that gold has an essence. Now, don't get me wrong, it can be rational to believe that something that is unobservable exists. For example, scientists rationally believed in the existence of atoms and their corresponding nucleus and electron shells, even though we weren't able to directly observe them or even have any kind of direct physical evidence of them at first. This is because, even before they were observed, the existence of atoms explained many different phenomena in science that had no other good explanation. For example, it explains how complex molecules form, why they weigh what they do, etc. Explanatory power is very important, and that an hypothesis offers up a good explanation is powerful evidence in its favor. If the soul hypothesis were able to explain how we are the same person over time, then that would be powerful evidence in its favor. I don't know if it'd be enough to overcome how it seems to violate physical laws, but it would be good evidence nonetheless. But, unfortunately, the soul hypothesis cannot explain personal identity over time. Having the same soul is neither necessary nor sufficient for personal survival, and what would distinguish one soul from another, and even what souls are made of, is a complete mystery. And so there is no reason to suppose that they exist, much less to think that they can provide an answer to our questions about personal identity over time. In fact, so little is understood about the soul that relying upon it as an explanation for personal survival is about as bad as giving no explanation at all. To help me make my point, let me borrow an example from one of my favorite books, Ted Schick and Louis Vaughn's book, How to Think About Weird Things. Suppose you are an engineer investigating a bridge collapse. You want to know what happened so you can avoid such things in the future. Someone comes along and says, "I know what happened. An incomprehensible being zapped it with an incomprehensible force." Intrigued, you ask, "Can you tell me anything about this incomprehensible being?" "No," he replies, "he is incomprehensible." "Can you tell me anything about the power used to make the bridge collapse?" "No," he says, "his power is incomprehensible." Would you include this explanation on a list of possible causes for the bridge's collapse? Of course not. "Thank you, move along," is all that you would likely say. But the soul hypothesis as an explanation for personal identity over time is not much better. The soul is an indescribable, non-understood substance for which we have no evidence. Suggesting that it accounts for how we are the same person over time is no better than just saying, "You just are," or "It's just magic." That's not to say that some people have not tried to revise the soul hypothesis to get around these problems. And that's also not to say that those theories don't raise problems of their own. Some philosophers, like Richard Swinburne, have tried to defend the "you just are" line of reasoning. They think you're the same person over time because you are numerically identical over time, and numerical identity is what philosophers call a brute fact, something that is just true without explanation. As a metaphysician, I want to dig deeper, and so I find such an answer unsatisfactory. If you're interested, take a look at the suggested readings. In this lecture, we have asked and come to understand a very important metaphysical question, the question of personal identity over time. How is it that you now and your 8-year-old self are numerically the same person? We have also seen something which is common in metaphysics. The easy, obvious answer doesn't work so well. Although the soul hypothesis is very popular, it falls drastically short as a metaphysical hypothesis and can't account for personal identity over time. But one of the thought experiments we considered can lead us to a new theory. Most people's intuitions suggest that if you woke up tomorrow as the king of China, but had no memories of your previous self, then you wouldn't really be the king of China. If your soul switched with another person, but your memories didn't, you wouldn't think that you actually switched bodies. You stay with your memories. So perhaps, somehow, memories play some kind of role in making you the same person over time. That is a concept that we will consider next lecture.